Welcome back to the Legacy Radio Network. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen, and this is the Everything Financial Radio Show. We're talking once again today with frequent guest on the program, Mr. Karl Denninger. If you have not checked out Karl's work, I would encourage you to go to market-ticker.org. He posts, I don't know, Karl, is there anything you do except research and write?
Well, I trade.
Well,
I mean, my intent is to attempt to make a profit from the craziness that's going on in the markets. And there's been times that I've done very well at that. There's times I do less well, and but that's the nature of the game. We're not always right. But this is I'm still doing it. I've been doing it since the 1990s, and so obviously I'm not a complete bust at this, or I would be out pushing carts at Walmart.
Exactly. Well, Karl, in the last segment, it was very interesting. I thought the conversation was great, given the Fitch warning, given that at a certain point, the game is up. You just simply can't keep spending a lot more than you're taking in forever. I thought I heard you say, at least indirectly, that you expect the day of reckoning will happen during these next 4 years. You can correct me if that assumption is wrong. But I know if there was a listener listening to that last segment, one of the big questions has to be, where do I go to keep my nest eggs safe? Comment on that, and what advice would you give them?
Well, first, I'm not a registered investment advisor. And secondly, even if I was, you can't give individual advice to somebody without understanding their individual situation. But with that said, there are two possible outcomes that come from this. And you have to kind of place your bets as to which way you think this goes. If you believe that there will be a hyperinflation, and let's distinguish that from ordinary inflation. The 1970s was ordinary inflation. Bad inflation, but it was just inflation. Hyperinflation is a loss of confidence in the currency where it essentially becomes toilet paper, like what happened in Weimar. If you believe that that's going to happen, then any asset denominated in dollars that is tradable and easily exchangeable for dollars is potentially worthless. And that's a huge problem because people say, well, I will buy gold or I will buy silver, and the first question is, do you have physical possession of it? Because if it's shares in some ETF or something, those can become worthless quite easily. And anybody that was trading with MS Global knows this. The other problem that you have is that even if you do take physical possession, you then need to guard it. And secondly, if there is a new currency of some kind, the government can certainly attempt to impose some kind of a tax on transfers into that currency and essentially make it impossible to spend. That's what FDR did in the 1930s. So you can have your wealth locked up in hard assets in a way that you can't get to it, or have it confiscated by the government, and there's plenty of ways to do that. And by the way, desperate people tend to do desperate things, and that includes governments when they get desperate. So you have to expect that's a possibility. The second possibility is that we have a deflationary scenario that gets going, and when that occurs, debt becomes very difficult to pay off, because the value of the currency goes up rather than down. That occurs as debt is defaulted. The amount of credit that is circulating in the system decreases. That makes each unit of credit and currency in the system more valuable. If that occurs, you want to be holding something that is physically convertible into cash on a rapid basis, or actual cash. And the reason is that as people find themselves under increasing amounts of duress, they will start puking up assets at ridiculously inexpensive prices in an attempt to keep their head above water, and you can snap those up, and over time you make a very nice fortune off of it. It's not something that gets you rich quickly, but this is what people did during the 1930s. They bought up productive factories and things like this as people had to throw them out into the world, so to speak. Got them at very low prices, and over the next 20, 30 years they made out very well. So you kind of have to take a bet there. There are a lot of people that are looking at trying to get their assets and such out of the United States, basically fleeing the country. That has become much more difficult. If you have billions of dollars, it's practical. But for the average person that is probably listening to this, it's not. So you kind of have to decide which way you think this thing's going to go and how it's going to play out. and or hedge for both outcomes. And I think for most people, what you want to do is kind of keep your ears to the ground and watch the tea leaves. I am not a believer in the hyperinflation scenario simply because if that happens, I believe that we are going to have a collapse of our civil society at a level that is going to make money more or less an irrelevant consideration. And I pray nightly that doesn't occur, because that's the kind of thing where cities burn and and all kinds of very unpleasant things happen.
Karl, you said you gave an example of what happened in the 30s, which was certainly a deflationary environment. Arguably, what we have in Greece now is a full-blown deflationary depression. And you mentioned Weimar. After the hyperinflation occurred and I believe it was the Rentenmark that was put in place as an interim currency backed by something tangible, at that point they also experienced deflation. So even if one subscribes to the hyperinflation model, isn't it inevitable that once inflation or hyperinflation ends and the dust settles, that then we still have to go through the deflationary environment, which is going to be very painful?
That's the problem, is that hyperinflation, people say, well, I can remain safe. The truth is that nobody remains safe in a situation where hyperinflation occurs, because what normally comes with that is a destruction of the government. Because remember, what goes down at the same time is the currency. So you have a trade dislocation. You have all of the evil things that go along with that. And then how do you compel people to go to work? Even something as simple as the local police department, fire department. If you can't pay them in something that's worth anything, where people are literally running out to spend every penny they make on on food on a daily basis before it can be devalued. These kinds of things destabilize societies, and you can only hope that there are more intelligent people in Washington, along within the state governments, that somebody's going to stand up and say, you know what, we've made promises to people we can't keep. We have to dial back our government to a level that we can actually afford to pay for. And yes, we know that you're not going to like this, and some of the politicians are going to have to accept that they'll get fired, maybe fired 3 or 4 times. We may go through 3 or 4 sets of Congresses during the process of adjusting this out, because nobody wins re-election. But the alternative is that we find ourselves in a situation where we have promised $200 trillion in medical payments to senior citizens. Well, we don't have any way to come up with $200 trillion.
Karl, that's a very interesting point that you just made, because certainly this problem cannot be solved without, in my view anyway, you can tell me whether or not you agree, a deflationary time frame, and certainly part of that deflation is going to have to be a dramatic scale back of entitlements, including Social Security and Medicare, and yet that wasn't a topic at all in the campaign, because obviously it doesn't sell. So how does this scale back occur?
There's only 2 choices. When it comes to, we have 2 interconnected sets of issues. We have medical care costs, not Medicare, Medicaid, medical care, the entire medical system, which is the driver of our budget situation. And you can either tell Granny, literally, along with everybody else in the country, that they're going to eat about $1 trillion every year on a forward basis, or you can tell the medical industry that they're going to eat $1 trillion. You're going to take the monopoly protections that they have enjoyed that have allowed them to run prices up to the degree that they have and pull them out of the system and let competition do what a competition always does. The problem with doing this is that this will result in huge contraction in employment and everything else related to that, okay, from the medical industry. So, again, GDP will contract dramatically. But once that adjustment has been taken, then we have that productive capacity has been released into the economy, and it will be channeled into other things. So the dislocation will come, it will pass, and then we'll move forward. When it comes to the other side, the other driver of this is defense spending and energy. And if you look at the federal budget, you will find that the places where we spend all of our money are Social Security, pensions, okay, although that is very close to actually being cash flow balanced. So you could get rid of this payroll tax cut and index Social Security retirement to longevity, and we actually would have fixed Social Security. Medicare, Medicaid, in its various forms, defense, and then welfare. Those 4 items are 85% of the federal budget. You fix 3 of those 4, or the federal government collapses. and you have to do it through those interconnections. We cannot continue to spend the money on defense, but we do it because we need the foreign energy sources. So we have to solve the energy problem to solve defense spending. And this is the interconnection that nobody talks about. Nobody wanted to have this discussion during the campaign. I was out yelling about it during the time that the campaign was going on, both in the mainstream and also within the Libertarian Party. Nobody would touch it. But this is what we must do as a nation. It's not about politics. It's about arithmetic.
You know, Karl, in the time we have left, we've got about 3 minutes left in this segment, maybe 3:15 or so. Let's talk about energy, because I know you do some writing in that area, and there's certainly the belief that the United States has oil resources, has natural gas resources, has really enough energy to provide for our own energy needs, and yet because of regulation and environmentalists, we're unable to do that. So we're forced to rely on foreign sources for energy. Comment, would you please?
The United States has available oil and natural gas in resources that we can tap by using the various enhanced extraction techniques such as fracking. However, this doesn't create more oil, it doesn't create more natural gas. It just sucks out of the ground what we have at a higher speed. So we are trading off tomorrow's supply for today's supply at a cheaper price. Now, you ought to understand, everybody ought to understand how that works. If you eat all the 20-cent candy bars and the rest are $1, what's going to happen a year or two from now? This produces a short-term panacea, an appearance of very low prices, which you've seen in natural gas over the last year or two. However, the depletion rates on those wells are much higher than traditional wells, for the simple reason that you're breaking up the rock underground, and therefore the gas flows out faster. This is not a long-term solution. The only long-term solution the United States has is found in nuclear power, and not the type of nuclear power we've been using, because it's incredibly inefficient and dangerous, but in different forms of nuclear power. In the future, of course, we'd hope it would be fusion, but that's off in the future somewhere. Today, however, we know how to do it using higher quality energy extraction from nuclear power. We just refuse, and a big part of the refusal is because we want to link our nuclear industry with defense, because we want nuclear bombs. That kind of thinking that shelters industry from this has to change. We need a Manhattan Project-style energy program in this country, and we need it now. And the reason is simply time. It will take between 5 and 10 years to develop this. We probably can get through that with the technologies that we have come up with for fracking and horizontal drilling and extraction and things like this. But we're going to reach the knee point. We have a lot of oil and a lot of natural gas, but we burned up all of the cheap oil and the cheap gas. And that's where the real problem is that we're not going to run out. It's just going to get extremely expensive, and that's going to come off of GDP.
Well, Karl Denninger, always a pleasure to have you on the program. We certainly enjoy our conversation with you, and time goes very, very quickly when you're here. So thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.
We will return after these words. Stay with us.